It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming. I guess I'm going to go straight into the excerpt. So I've been playing around with what I read, and this is the first time I read this one. So let's see how it goes. This is the beginning of chapter 4, which is called, I'll tell you what it's called, Disciplined into Obedience. And the theme is humiliation. So it's very upbeat. When young women come to work for her as swim instructors, Joanne, a recreation and parks manager in California, has to sit them down and have a very particular kind of conversation with them she does not have to have with her male recruits. While new coaches' induction might include conversations around safety protocols, kids' ages, and progress reports, the conversation Joanne finds herself having with young women is around word delivery. Joanne says instructors, male or female, will shout, "Kick, kick, kick," in the same way to the children perfecting their swim strokes, but to very different reception from closely monitoring parents. Female swim coaches who don't add enough upspeak in their voice when they are yelling kick across the pool deck are often seen as mean, while their male co-workers can yell all they want, Joanne explains, referring to the practice of rising intonation at the end of a sentence so that it sounds like a question. She also suggests they add positive, encouraging phrases like, "You got it," something men do not need to do. If women do not sweetly modulate their voices as they question mark their way through kick, 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 leg movement directions, Joanne says she has learned the hard way it will only be a matter of days before parents will come forward to complain. Joanne does not need a sociology textbook to teach her about counter-stereotypic backlash, that punishing effect that happens to women refusing to adhere to the kind, sweet, and demure trope mentioned in earlier chapters, which I hope you'll all read later. She has seen it summer after summer with every new cohort of swim instructors coming in. That is the only way that people can take women's voices, she states bluntly. Tweaking and altering your authentic self to adhere to what is expected of you as a woman, either to please others or for fear of serious repercussion in the form of social penalties like angry parents, economic penalties like job loss, or physical penalties like violence, is emotional labor. It is not only emotional labor, it is emotional labor with the threat of a slap on the wrist or more if you don't do it. When performed in public before an audience, emotional labor imposed on subjugated groups serves to infantilize and delegitimize those doing it. As an active expression of a submissive, non-confrontational status, it also presents the power status quo as inevitable, paralyzing those doing emotional labor in place. Detecting how thoroughly and actively enforced these processes are helps lift the curtain on the ways in which persistent forms of inequality are maintained. Even emotions, as they are felt and displayed, are far more intertwined with cultural context than most realize. Over the last 10 years, the field of neuroscience has moved away from understanding emotions as innate and universal, stamped on the brain from birth. Instead, it now sees emotions as creations of the brain, influenced by the constant, active absorption of the world around us through our 5 senses, mixed with predictions based on experience. If emotions do not just happen, poof, like a sneeze or a knee-jerk, but are instead constructed by our brain, itself reflecting information it has collected from the broader environment, emotional labor describes the part of the process through which emotions are not just produced, but managed. As our brain manages the production of emotions, it pays attention to context, understanding nuances of appropriateness or the weight of expectations. It is aware of conventions of feeling that dictate that we should feel happy at a party and sad during a wake. Even when our internal emotions do not match the occasion, we are aware of cultural display rules which will guide us to appear somber as a form of respect, even if we are not internally feeling desolate at that wake. When you assess your surroundings and modulate your emotional display, or even your actual emotions to suit and interact with the context, you are performing emotional labor. In sociology, tweaking your internal feelings to match the situation is referred to as deep acting, and tweaking the display of them is surface acting. Both are emotional labor. These feeling rules, which take into account the situation and conventions, can be totally different for two separate people in the exact same context. Feeling rules women are expected to abide by, for example, are often vastly different from those required of men. This is why Joanne has to advise the young women swim coaches to channel Marilyn Monroe in Some Like It Hot when they are giving basic swim instructions and needn't bother with the young men. While men are limited from childhood in the range of emotion they are expected to have the capacity of feeling, they are paradoxically given more space to be unfiltered in public. Women, treated like emotional thermostats, whether they like it or not only must constantly manage their own feelings, but they are also held responsible for the feelings of others. When women are told to smile by a stranger on the street, they are being reminded of this through harassment. When women going about their business are accused of having a resting bitch face, they are being reminded of their expected, constant, enthusiastic performance for the benefit of the world. A man not smiling while going about a task is never told he has a resting dick face. He's likely treated as busy and important, if his expression is noted at all. In recent popular memory, nowhere was this kind of feeling rule double standard more evident than during the September 2018 public confirmation hearings of now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and his sexual assault accuser, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, watched by an estimated 20 million people across America. On the morning of September 27th, 2018, an emotionally affected but never overridden by emotions, Dr. Ford gave a contained, clear testimony of her alleged assault at the hands of then Judge Kavanaugh and a friend of his while they were all teenagers. Not once did she raise her voice, and every detail of her interaction with the Senate Judicial Committee was polite, deferential, and sweet, from asking for a Coke. I think after my opening statement, I anticipate needing some caffeine, if that is available, to putting her questioner's needs before her own when they proposed a break. Does that work for you? Does that work for you as well? Peppered throughout the heart-wrenching testimony was a constant lowering of the gaze. In the afternoon, an angry and at times tearful Kavanaugh gave his own roaring, combative testimony. He raised his voice constantly. When it came to questioning, Kavanaugh was elusive, unaccommodating, interrupting, rude, and at times bullying. Kavanaugh's gaze remained undaunted, his eyes looking straight ahead. When Senator Amy Klobuchar probed him on whether there was any time drinking had caused him to forget what had happened or part of what had happened the night before, he answered provocatively, "You're talking about blackout, I don't know, have you?" After she insisted he answer her question, his interjection doubled down on insolence. "Yeah, and I'm curious if you have." Kavanaugh was not only being the opposite of deferential, he was flauntingly disrespectful and belittling of the senator. In fact, Kavanaugh refused to answer dozens of questions put to him, whereas Ford dodged none. The juxtaposition of the two testimonies makes for a perfect example of how two members with the same background are often encouraged to adhere to entirely opposite feeling rules. Both Ford and Kavanaugh are of a similar origin class: white, privately educated, both enjoying privileged socioeconomic status, which they have maintained in part by reaching the highest levels in their respective professional fields of psychology and law. The contrast in their starkly disparate emotion display can be boiled down to one key difference: gender. Ford, a well-respected professor of psychology at Palo Alto University and researcher at Stanford University, could never have behaved the way Kavanaugh did and remain credible. Everything about her demeanor and expression was the emblem of what is not only expected, but allowed of a woman in public. To be not only likable, but amenable too, always putting others' needs before her own. Emotional labor taking cues from cultural display rules becomes the way in which women are forced to express their place in the hierarchy, serving others as a priority. That is the only way women will be given space. As perfect as her gendered performance was, Ford's testimony was ultimately disregarded, even if her courage in testifying and taking space undoubtedly moved the cultural conversation forward. To gain access to a public arena only with the precondition of performing the opposite of defiance, affability, compliance, submission, may prevent women from being booted out or discredited entirely, but it also minimizes any challenging of existing structures of power, which is undoubtedly the point. When almost 4 years after Kavanaugh's confirmation, the nation watched Senate confirmation hearings for then Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black female nominee to the United States Supreme Court, the gendered double standards on display were compounded with the double standards of race. Jackson's countenance as she faced at times mocking and aggressive questions from male members of the committee was a discouraging reminder that while this was a historic moment, black women still faced perpetual public indignities, however polished or impressive their track records were. The now justice's composure and endurance as she maintained an emotional evenness over days were rightfully lauded, but it was hard not to also see the moment as a public exhibition in racial and sexist abuse performed with impunity. Nor would a woman in her position have had much of a choice. For women who are not white and people from minority groups, prioritizing the feelings of people from more socially dominant groups, whether white people, men, or both, can present itself as a precondition for taking up any kind of public space. But the act of adapting to living in a white male supremacy can quickly deviate into sacrificing parts of oneself in order to exist. One woman I spoke to, Danielle, recalls learning to code switch as a black kid in white spaces, developing a strategy of killing them with kindness. When a white girl at school took to calling her Danny, she didn't fight it, even if she loathed the nickname and felt robbed of the ability to define herself on her own terms. I remember that was the first experience accepting a thing I hated in order for me to be accepted. I was just like, fine, in order to manage this space, being accepted in this white space, I have to accept this nickname, she recounts. She carried this emotional labor lesson that to be kind and to be loving somehow diminished the walls of difference through to her work as a professor in public health at an elite majority white institution. There, she chose early on to connect with her students on an emotional level on top of an intellectual one. As an openly queer black woman and working mother in a long-term same-sex relationship, she found that using her experiences helped students fully grasp the gravity and complexity of issues discussed. Listening to her, their professor, they couldn't look the other way. They had to face realities they were unfamiliar with. They had to empathize. I am not only teaching through the texts, I am talking through my life. I have used my body, my identity, myself as a teaching tool by my own volition, but still appreciating that that requires emotional labor and work. But this emotional labor deployed for the benefit of others, for the benefit of pushing culture forward, building empathy, and enacting progress, as needed as it is, has started to be weaponized against her. Almost as if the act of performing this emotional labor has given students carte blanche to treat her as a mere tool to make them feel better. Increasingly, Danielle has found that the limits of consensual emotional labor are being pushed, often violated, by the same students whose compassion she is trying to build. She shares one story about a young white male student who recently asked her to meet after a class she taught on the negative impact of racism on health outcomes. She sat with him and expected questions about the course material, but he had none. Instead, he recounted a racist incident he had participated in and that he now felt bad about. It quickly became apparent that he had no intellectual question to put to her. Rather, he wanted to feel better about himself without doing any work, and he thought she could or should give that to him. He wanted absolution. The worst part, she tells me, is this is hardly the first time she has been in a situation like this, obliged to not only bear witness to the recounting of violence, but also carry the burden of that violence and in turn perform some kind of added ceremony of emotional labor, waving an imaginary wand and reverting the person's conscience back to innocence. This is emotional labor that frays at her sense of full personhood, the one that is claimed from her by people who believe it is her job as a mammy meets genie meets Jesus Christ figure, not theirs, to cleanse them of their own wrongdoing. It is a strange, degrading mechanism where she is reduced to being the object through which other people expect to have their emotions validated. I'm almost done. For women, generally, being treated as the vehicle for other people's feelings is an exercise in objectification that often merges both emotional and physical presentation requirements. Being held accountable for the entire emotional experience of the people around them means women are often forced to present as a perceived part of emotive expression in very narrow ways. This checks out for Joanne, the recreation manager, as the emotional labor performance she feels forced to introduce to her young female recruits extends to physical appearance. I tell them, I know other men dress like that, like in cargo shorts or whatever they want, but people will expect you to dress better. Is it fair? No. Is it practical to tell them? To Joanne, yes, it is. It is all part of the female experience, she tells me. Even in arenas where pleasant behaviors and appearance seem to totally secondary, like politics, how people feel when they look at women is a subject of scrutiny first, serving as a disqualifying factor. In the run-up to the 2016 presidential elections, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was continuously slammed for not smiling enough, not being likable enough, and her appearance examined ad nauseum. In a 2020 Hulu documentary named Hillary, Clinton explains how, unlike her male opponents, she felt she had no choice but to spend 1 hour a day on hair and makeup. Over the 600 days of her presidential campaign, she calculated that that amounted to 25 days around the clock of time she lost to hair and makeup alone. Spending 25 days around the clock in hair and makeup when all you want is for your brain to be listened to sounds like the plot of a horror movie, like a feminist version of Jordan Peele's 2017 movie Get Out, a nightmare you are stuck in and can't figure your way out of. These forced gender practices, a balancing act full of landmines that could lead to failure at any time, are an entry fee into public life for women and are a price men do not have to pay. This gives women a very real handicap. In Clinton's example, time equivalent to almost 1 entire month. But the handicap extends itself out beyond being a simple drain on energy and time, as opportunities to be in the public eye have hugely expanded for women over the last decade. As previous formal barriers to public life have lifted, so too has the volume and level of feedback audiences inflict on them. This is true whether audiences are parents at a swim lesson, friends and acquaintances on social media, or television viewers of a political debate. These audiences' belief that they have blanket entitlement to women's emotional labor creates a feedback loop that transforms any moment a woman is watched into an opportunity for disciplining. Watching and commenting as a woman tiptoes her way along, awaiting a fall or a stumble, has become a public spectacle in which humiliation is both a tool and an objective. Because the performances women are pushed into doing, from tweaking attractiveness up or down to voice sweetening and grinning, are easily seen as superficial, slutty, or silly. Pointing the finger and laughing condescendingly is all too easy. This reality, instead of receding with women's legal progress, has only intensified. Today, women are more scrutinized and more set up for humiliation than ever. There we go. That's it.
So we're completely improvising here, and Rose is a more experienced interviewer than I am, so it's going to end up being more of a conversation, but I think the first thing that struck me about that segment is we're characterizing women's emotion in the workplace, well, emotional labor, sometimes in the workplace, as a weakness or a vulnerability for them, but in your interviews, when have you found it to be a potential strength?
Right. Thank you. So, to be honest, I started off the book I started the book project when I was a reporter with The Guardian in 2015. And at the time, emotional labor had just exploded into the mainstream as a term to describe this double standard that was happening, especially in the workplace, but also at home. And it was seen as a negative thing. And so when I started this book, I kind of thought of it as this symbol of women's subjugation, this kind of extra shift of work that was expected of women and other marginalized groups. And actually, as I was researching the book, there was a massive shift that happened. And I actually started to understand that there's actually huge strength in emotional labor. Emotional labor is a form of work that is incredibly valuable, essential, not just to our economy, but also to societies, to families, to the way in which communities are run. The problem with emotional labor is not that it exists. The problem with emotional labor is it is artificially devalued, rendered invisible, offloaded onto a whole bunch of groups that are generally feminized, racialized, and that we refuse to really see what they're doing as real, let alone real work. So the moment where I start understanding it as valuable is the moment really that I understand it as the essential form of work that we need to run societies, communities, families, our economy.
Is there a sense in which when men don't put the emotional labor in for the same jobs, what's the conclusion of this sentence? Is there some disadvantage to them if they are not performing the emotional labor?
I mean, formally, I don't think so, but objectively, yes. So I think one of the reasons that emotional labor exited just the halls of academia, where it's been studied for the last 40 years, is two things. I think privileged women who thought that they had achieved equality in their relationships at home when they had families were suddenly finding that they were expected to provide still the majority of care, even if they were sharing in the breadwinning activities. They also were expected to take care of everyone's well-being, which is emotional labor, in a way that maybe some of them were very happy to do, but didn't feel like there was any kind of sharing of the load. So I think that happened in private. And then in public, what happened, which is what you're referring to, is college-educated women suddenly en masse entered previously male-dominated workforces and were finding that on top of the normal job, let's say a lawyer, instead of just being expected to be a lawyer, was suddenly expected to also be terribly nurturing and other-oriented and put out the people first. And so these double standards by women who were very privileged felt very wrong to them. And I think suddenly conversations were started, this doesn't feel right. So then to go back to your question, in the workplace, if you are in the white-collar industry, in order to get ahead as a man, you have to do two things, which is you have to be competent at what you're doing, and you have to be very confident. And that's the recipe that studies show will help you get ahead. As a woman, studies, especially studies over the last 10 years, have started revealing very clearly that you have to be competent, you have to be good at your job, you have to be confident, but then you also have to be extremely nurturing and other-oriented. Otherwise, you get punished. There's a backlash effect that happens. So there's a kind of a triple shift that's happening. So in the workplace, if a man is suddenly going to be nurturing and other-oriented, as long as he's the two first things, he probably is going to get praised for being incredibly thoughtful and, isn't, Mike nice. But a woman doing that is not going to be seen, rewarded, or acknowledged. She's just going to be seen as, okay, she's doing the bare minimum. She's not a threat. We can, she can advance. So, this is all the case. But as I mentioned towards the end of the book, and I'm sure as you know, as a professor in the business school, is that actually there's increasing amounts of research that's very clear about the fact that team leaders, for example, that have a lot of emotional intelligence, that do a lot of emotional labor, are the teams where, workers are the happiest. There's a higher degree of retention. The best leaders actually are not just aggressive, kind of narcissistic, dominant figures. Actually, the best leaders, from what I've read from the fields of organizational psychology, are actually the ones who do emotional labor really well, whether male or female.
But they also have to be seen as highly competent. We did a little pre-interview, and I told this story. This is a very old story now because it involves teaching at a business school while pregnant. I don't advise doing that, by the way. But at a certain point, it is not optional. When my older child was born, I was teaching at Northwestern, and I got on the elevator one day, about 6 months pregnant, new course. Students come onto the elevator and they don't see me, and one says to the other, "Who have you got for marketing?" And the second one says, "The pregnant one." Like, he had no idea what my name was. He'd been in class for a couple of weeks. And I have to say, that pretty much characterized the way that term went. I taught competently, and I know that I did because they were tested objectively on the material that I taught them. But generally, they told me, for example, I was not highly competent in teaching the math, right? The struggle with a business school is always power and confidence. They need to know that they're in good hands. And I looked like I had someone else on my mind, right? Like, literally. So scroll ahead 4.5 years, and I'm arriving at Michigan for the first time, and I am also equally pregnant the first day in the class, and I had decided that there was such a thing as a kind of an optimal level of femininity. Like, there were 2 women on faculty at Northwestern that were pregnant at the same time as I was, and they were badasses. They were really tough women who had a reputation of being just a little bit bitchy, which sometimes you have to do. But then when they got pregnant, they got back into the comfort zone again. Like, you are a little bit off the rails, and now you seem like you might be a nicer person. But my vibe has always been a little bit on the mom side, and so that vibe combined with maternity was just too much. So when I walked into the business school to teach my first class, visibly pregnant, I decided I had to ratchet up my base level expectations, and I went in there with an artificial chip on my shoulder, and I said, look, you have to show up to class, you have to be on time. If you're not on time, there's going to be a demerit, and here's what I mean by on time. If I'm talking when you come in the room, you're late. I am not your mother. I literally said that. I am somebody's mother, but I am not your mother. And they just ate it up. That was in 25 years, that was the best teaching rating I ever had. And I understood it to be what I called sort of the Ginger Rogers phenomenon, which if you're old enough, you might remember that Ginger Rogers was Fred Astaire's dance partner, and it was said of Ginger Rogers that she did everything he did backwards and in high heels. And so that was what I was going for, and I temporarily got. I am competent, and I have that third thing too. But it hadn't occurred to me until you started talking about it that burden is not something that most of my male counterparts are obliged to do. They can do it, but they don't have to. And over the years, the dynamic has been, I have to make them believe they're in hyper-competent hands, and only then can I add that mom vibe back into it. And it's gotten a little easier now that I'm older than they are. I wasn't when I first started. And now the vibe is, I'm just going to mom you a lot, and if you don't like it, you have a problem. It's not my problem. But it's not something that you can do if you're not in a very privileged position.
I mean, it speaks to the very tight rope that I think so many women, especially women starting out in the workforce who maybe have high ideals, it's very hard for those women to figure out how they can, at the same time appear aggressive and assertive and capable and on the flip end, be kind enough that they're not going to be seen as a bitch, which is really kind of the, so it's like this, it's not just a tightrope. For some women, it's a catch-22, because it's very hard to convey all of these different, to have all of these different emotional displays going at exactly the same time. And I think for women of my generation, I'm a geriatric millennial, which is the technical term. Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg, that was a huge phenomenon in my 20s. I think her TED Talk was 2009 and her book was 2013. And at the time, women were told, basically, it's your fault that you're not getting to the top of industries. You're being too apologetic. You're not taking up a place at the table. You need to, claim that what's yours and speak up, and that will get you to get ahead. And we know, because of the studies that have been done since, across organizational psychology and beyond, that that's not true, actually. If women do that too much and are not then compensating with being nurturing, they're going to be penalized. They're not going to get promoted. They're seen as threatening. I interviewed for the book a woman who was told she was really abrasive for a woman after she just spoke up in a marketing meeting as part of the marketing team. And I think this is part of the double standards we need to talk about and ideally evolve out of. We live in a world and in a time where we're told that we should all bring our authentic selves to work, but what we're seeing is only some people can bring their authentic selves to work, and a lot of other people, women, people of color, cannot bring their authentic. If your authentic self was more of a mothering style and kind in your delivery at the business school, you obviously learned to go quickly in the lift or the elevator, that's not something you could do if you wanted to be respected and get the great student ratings that you deserved in.
I have conversations with other male faculty about this sometime. I will say, I can't do it the way you do it. And he says, no, you're supposed to do it the way that we do it. We should all be able to do it the same way. And I'm thinking, no, if I did it that way, I would not get the same result that you get.
Totally.
So it's been a bit of a challenge, but it's mitigated with age and also with my deliberately crafting my job in a way that the downsides of that are minimized. Like running a classroom is difficult, right? But running a 4 or 5 person work team on Zoom is different. And so I do more of that than I used to do. So that leads me to another question, which is I was thinking about, I was going to introduce Rose and we ended up not doing that, but I was looking at her bio on her website, and she started out in journalism. Well, she may have done other things before, but there was a time where you worked for the AP in Rome, and then you came to the US and you got a master's degree, and you've been freelancing for The Guardian and other places, and now you're writing your own book. And there's also been a lot of moving around. So I was thinking about the issue of crafting a way of making a living that allows the balance of emotional work that you want. And I'm wondering if that has been something you have deliberately tried to do or been able to do.
That's a wonderful question. I need to think about that. I will say that one of the wonderful things, so when I went back to journalism in this country, I was a freelancer at first, and then I worked for The Guardian for a bit, and that was during a time where I was living in New York, and I was expected to go into the office once a week. And I did, and actually, one of the things that you're confronted with when you're suddenly working in an office environment is office politics, and all of the various kind of subtle inequities that reproduce themselves, whether it's in editorial meetings, in my case in meetings, and I mean, it's pretty terrible. The Guardian is supposed to be a very progressive place, but like many other places that pretend to be progressive, it's not necessarily as much when you actually get behind the closed doors. And, I will say that I was actually thinking about this today. I think for so many of us, there are the skills of the job that we're taught to do and that we think is really what's going to help us get ahead. So, in my case, I basically I'm a very formally trained journalist. I trained with AP and I had my credentials. But then for so many of us in journalism and way beyond, there are a couple of skill sets that end up being kind of the cornerstone of how successful you are in your career and how much you enjoy your career. And that is basically being able to deal with group dynamics in the office and figure out expectations and then communication, honestly, public speaking. So I would say emotional labor for so many of us, whether it's a formal part of the job or not, is a huge part of whether you get ahead or not. So to go back to your question, which is how did I negotiate basically making a living and emotional labor requirements? The truth is in my 20s, I survived on very little. My book deal actually was pretty decent. But there was a trade-off that I made, which was, I also, to be very transparent, most authors, writers, journalists, if they're not in a newsroom full-time, have side jobs. So that's part of what I did. But I think the reason I chose more economic insecurity versus a job that gave me healthcare, etc., is because I didn't have to be a part of these, bigger dynamics that I saw as very oppressive, that I saw as having to adhere to other people's expectations in ways that didn't feel fair. And so I always tried to basically support myself, including very modestly at times, so that I didn't have to deal with all of these double standards, with all of these power struggles. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I never had the mirror turned on me like this.
There's a lot that has to do with what's in your portfolio of coping strategies is really driven by privilege, right? So what I'm able to do in crafting my job is driven by the fact that it is a lucrative job, and I have a fully employed partner that will always have his health insurance, and I'm in a labor union, which really helps. And when I get to the point where I don't want to do it anymore, I can pull back. That is not the story that anybody else has.
Right. That's a wonderful, so exactly. So in order to basically be absolved of a lot of forced coercive emotional labor that I did not want to do, I had to pick economic precariousness is effectively what you've talked me into saying. Exactly. and I will, actually, that's a great point, because that's a point I wanted to make earlier when you were talking about also how your kind of slightly forced emotional labor that you had to provide while teaching had evolved as you got older. Because one point that's really interesting to make, that I make in the book, is we think of emotional labor as being just about gender. And in fact, it's about power. So the more power you have, the less emotional labor you have to provide, the less emotional labor that is expected from you. So if you think of it,
the more flexibility in its expression.
Exactly.
Right?
So you can still do it, but it's not a necessary part of you showing up, for example. So if you think about it outside of gender, race, or class, you can think of it in terms of a company structure, where the intern at the absolute bottom is going to be expected to be very deferential to the person above them. And that manager above them is going to be expected to be very deferential to the CEO. And then what happens in the workplace is when you complicate it with gender and race, say, is that a woman who's in a manager position might still have to provide actually way more emotional labor than male, colleagues at her same level, and so on and so forth. So basically, because emotional labor is sold as a fixed feminine trait, it's not. It's something that's performed actively, which is what that passage really tries to explain. And at the same time, it's that's where the trap is, because we're being forced to provide reassuring amounts of emotional labor, say, that then ends up looking like we're performing kind of servitude and submissiveness.
I will tell one more story, then I think maybe we'll go for questions. The difficulty in a classroom that is always, with one exception in 30 years, dominantly male, sometimes 75% male, is that they will always challenge you at the very beginning of the semester. They will ask really aggressive questions. And the subtext of those questions, which I know because I'm doing my emotional labor, is, did I make a mistake to be in your class? Are you really in control? I spent all this money, and why didn't I have a regular professor? And the difficulty with that is when you're issued the challenge, it is a self-negating sort of thing. Like the minute it comes out of their mouth, you have lost control of the classroom. So if you see prohibited behavior, like if they're on their phone or something, you have to get them to stop without stopping. So like if Jerry were on his phone, I would just be lecturing and I would just, I would walk right over to him and keep lecturing. I'm still in charge of the room, and I wouldn't normally physically touch a student, but I would just get right in his face. And then I would, with still lecturing, and then I would go right back to the lectern. And I had to do that because I needed the rest of the class to know I have control. But it made me nuts. Anyway, I see we're getting a signal for...
I was actually just nodding in agreement, having also taught at the University of Michigan, so yes. But yeah, let's open it up for some questions. Anybody has any?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. This is great, and it's great to hear about your work. I wonder if you could say a bit about the research strategy. So this is a nerd question of like, how did you decide whom to target and sort of class and geography and sort of, this is a nerd question about sort of your sampling strategy and how did you know where to look?
Right, that is a great question. And obviously as a journalist, unlike in academia, there's no real kind of technical anything really. You can just go. So I was really, really determined to prove that this wasn't just a silly, privileged white woman issue. So I knew that I had to really have a huge intersection of interviews to speak for themselves. So I did a few things. I was very lucky that my editor, my long-term features editor at The Guardian, allowed me to do a call out in The Guardian. So I published a call out for women's stories. That was fall of 2017, just after the Me Too movement had taken hold. So what ended up happening is I had a vast amount of women sharing their harassment and assault stories, which does constitute one chapter of the book, because obviously living in a world where you are considered prey is its own form of emotional labor, even if you're not constantly being attacked or harassed. You have to live with the memory of it, you have to live with the legacy of it in your family, etc. But that did mean that the experiences were kind of very particular and raw. I also did a call out to my broader professional and personal acquaintances, and a lot of people came to me through that. And then I was really wanted to not just get a huge sample of different people across ages and demographics. I also wanted people across different professions. So a lot of the emotional labor heavy stories there, I tried to specifically, I tried to talk to nannies. I tried to talk to people in the healthcare industry. At the beginning of COVID, it became, very clear that I needed to speak to as many people, who qualified as quote unquote essential workers. It's a very imperfect, non-academic approach. I ended up interviewing hundreds and hundreds of not just women, but just people. And then the kind of biggest part of it, on top of the interviews, was trying to digest a lot of information across academic disciplines, getting professors to speak to me and to point me in the right direction in terms of where the research was, and then trying to understand it and write it on the paper for non-academic audiences. And actually one of the things that happened over the years that I did all this research is my writing style changed a bit, because I was reading far too much academic stuff. So I became very dry and actually a bit long-winded. And that's my editor. That was the biggest thing that was the biggest intervention. I think I'm still probably a little on the academic side. But I believe that this topic deserves that seriousness. So I prefer erring on that side as opposed to going too far into, let's say, anecdotes and personal experience. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I can project enough. I'm wondering if it's changed at all, if it's gotten any better. I spent the day with my mother today, taking care of her, more unpaid, unvalued labor. And her generation thinks that these are things that we just do, that it is innate, that it is just something as a woman that you're supposed to do, and you're nurturing by virtue of your gender. Has it gotten better generationally? I'm 58 years old, and I'm a Title IX baby. I'm a punk, you know. That's what saved me. But is it better among younger people? Do they have to do as much as was expected as like my mother's generation, or do they defy it, like my generation did?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes and no. So I think I think we're having better discussions around gender traits, even if it's obviously very contentious in this country right now. I think that rigid separation of women are emotional creatures and men are rational creatures, not everywhere, but in a lot of spheres, has been dispelled, thankfully. I also think we're at a very particular moment where we can no longer avoid the imminent future where AI is going to be taking away not just the physical jobs that it came for first, but intellectual jobs, what has been seen, what has been put on a pedestal for a very long time. The Biden administration today announced a huge $600 billion package of investment that's specifically going to happen in the care industries, effectively, not just helping people access care, but also helping people train to be in those care jobs that are effectively the jobs we cannot replace. You know, you can automate a customer service representative, but fundamental emotional labor, which is person-to-person connection, cannot be automated. So I think there's a shift in terms of what my book really calls for is a massive shifting in our value system that finally recognizes and rewards emotional labor for the actual worth that it's providing. And as we recognize that, the idea is we also recognize the workers, whether they're formal workers or people who wouldn't be seen as workers, but actually providing the care that's so essential to our economy, to parents, to children, to relatives. So, I mean, there's a need for it to shift. It's urgent. And at the same time, toys have never been more gendered, you know. We're pushing young girls and boys into such drastic artificial extremes. And as I pointed out in that passage, you know, later on in that chapter, I interviewed a former Miss Michigan, Ariana Kwan, who was the first Asian American woman to ever win Miss Michigan. And I describe all of the atrocious, not just labor conditions she goes through, but the atrocious trolling she went through online. And, you know, we think of, let's say, beauty pageants as being a very old school thing that we've long been done with, but the scrutiny has never been at a more, you know, at a higher level because of our screens, because we're on social media. And so the feedback loop for girls and women and that constant testing of are you a good enough woman, basically, to even be taking up any kind of space is just, I mean, it's so loud, you know, a lot of girls and women can't hear anything else. So that's the no part. But the yes part is hopeful, I hope. Thank you.
I know we're pretty close to time, but I had one other question I wanted to ask, which is there's a story you tell towards the end of the book about a man, I think, standing up at a conference, and he says that, I wrote it down, that basically you have to make a choice between respect and authenticity. And I was really struck by that, and I was not 100% certain whether you endorsed that or said it's true now, but it shouldn't be, or whether it's only true for that guy. Do we really have to make a choice between being our authentic selves and getting respect?
I think in an ideal world, no. I think the point that he was making, it kind of, to me, inscribed itself within ongoing conversations around free speech, specifically who is allowed to have free speech and who has to adapt to the center and mute themselves. And the point I see him as making, this is a guy called Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is one of the foremost organizational psychologists of his generation. He wrote a book called Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? It's because we over-reward narcissism. And we mistake confidence for competence, but that's his. So I think the point that he was making was specifically targeting actually bigotry, let's say transphobia, racism, etc. That basically, let's say, for white men in formerly white male-dominated spheres, there is a need for them to tweak their authentic selves more. There is a need for them to be more empathetic, at least do more emotional labor, even if they don't feel like that's their authentic selves. And I think as things stand, they're not expected to do that. They're expecting everyone else to do it. They're refusing to recognize that they're expecting everyone else to do it. They're offloading, everyone else has to adapt to their culture. And I think the broader point that he tries to make is that in a world where everyone has to be respectful of each other, everyone, not just one group helping facilitate the privileged experience of another group, but everyone basically being thoughtful and caring and respectful, that society, which he calls an altruistic society, is actually the society that does the best, as opposed to a society where you have a lot of people being unfiltered, and as their unfiltered prejudice comes out, and then everyone else who's basically being attacked by that prejudice has to adapt to them, which is kind of much more what we're in right now. So, I mean, it's almost like this is like very kind of idealistic thinking, but of course, ideally, we get to a point where we're all actually naturally very other-oriented. We've all been trained to be other-oriented. We're all respectful of our fellow human beings. We're not being transphobic or racist or sexist. And so therefore, we're all able to exist together in community without it being inauthentic. But there is a degree to which right now, authenticity is really a privilege of a happy few who don't have to do any emotional labor. And honestly, a lot of the rest of us, we have to be inauthentic. You have to go up to the student and get very close, which is not necessarily what you want to do, but in order to get ahead as a professor and get the ratings that you need to keep your job, maybe, I don't know, maybe you didn't need to, you're in a labor union, but you have to, be slightly inauthentic. And actually the catch-22 in that kind of way of thinking is that we live in a society that pretends that authenticity is the be-all and end-all, so that those of us doing emotional labor not only have to do emotional labor, which is inauthentic to us, say, we also have to pretend we're being authentic with it. So we have to be like, oh yeah, I'm just like a really naturally sweet person. And so that's why you also get a lot of people who say, oh, I'm just a people pleaser, that's who I am, which I got a lot in interviews. And then they break down what they're doing and they're exhausted and they're barely getting through the day or the week or whatever it is, but they've convinced themselves, because society is constantly telling them they have to say, this is why, this is really who I am. Yeah.
Any more questions? Because I know we're right at 7:30 and we wanted to leave time for Rose to sign books if anyone would like that.
I have a question for you.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Just if I can close out. So some of the literature in sociology talks about burnout and the degree to which when you're doing that surface acting that I referred to in that passage, that's one of the things that leads to burnout the most, that you're very aware that you're having to fake the way you're appearing. And I'm wondering whether that was ever a negotiation with you and your job and the way in which you had to present. And
Yes, I think over the years I've come back from full-time work, cutting down a little bit and crafting the job so that it had the parts that I liked and not the parts that I didn't like. And that might have been burnout. I remember the semester my father passed away, leaving the classroom and thinking, well, maybe I won't do that anymore. Like I said before, it was kind of a luxury for me. It was a luxury that I had that other people don't really get, to be able to craft their jobs in a way that makes them survivable. So I don't know what advice I could offer anyone else, because I've been very, very lucky.
thank you so much, Christie.
Thanks.
And thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Hey, everybody.